close your eyes and set aside all the stressful worries of this modern world. Don't think about that huge rent payment coming due at the end of the month. Forget about your credit card statements and erase from your mind that passive-aggressive email your boss sent at 5 p.m. on Friday. What a wonderful feeling of relief, isn't it? Great. But now, when you open your eyes again, we have a little surprise for you. You're not in your cozy room right now. You're 10 million years in the past. You're in the dead center of a pitch-black forest. You're wearing nothing but a plain bison hide. The air is freezing enough to cut through your skin. And your biggest problem is this. Your stomach is growling so loudly and violently that the sound could even startle the mammoths grazing in the neighboring valley. You've been on the move with your tribe for days and haven't managed to catch a single decent prey. Famine is looming, and hope is running out. Just as you're thinking, I guess this is as far as we go, the wind carries a strange scent to your nose. It's very sharp, a scent that stings the bridge of your nose. But at the same time, it's strangely sweet and slightly sour. You timidly part the bushes to look where the scent is coming from. On the ground, at the base of an old tree, lies a pile of brown fruit, crushed, bubbling, and oozing strange liquids after days under the scorching sun. Under normal circumstances, if you saw even the tiniest blemish on the fruit you bought at the grocery store today, you'd throw it away, wouldn't you? Any rational creature would run away from that stinking pile without looking back. But you're not a modern picky person. You're an ancient hunter, literally on the brink of starvation. Just like our friend Grug, whose standards are incredibly low and whose genetic blueprint is genetically bulletproof. Grug looks at that rotten heap lying on the ground, swallows hard, and saying, "What's the harm?" begins shoveling handfuls of those foamy fruits into his mouth. The taste is truly awful. It burns his throat, and the sourness makes him wrinkle his nose. But a few minutes later, something miraculous begins to happen in Grug's primitive body and mind. That stressed-out brain, which just moments ago was trembling with fear that a saber-toothed tiger might emerge from the bushes, suddenly takes a deep breath. His muscles relax, and the enormous weight on his shoulders lifts. Grug even glances at the tree next to him and starts grinning to himself for no reason. Congratulations, dear friends. You've made a magnificent start towards the first morning after a night of drinking in human history. Today, we consider alcohol a modern luxury, something we consume in stylish, well-lit bars, at grand celebrations, or around tables with confidants. We've built massive multi-billion-dollar industries around it. But the real truth lies hidden in a much more primitive struggle for survival. This liquid was the result of the greatest gamble humanity ever made against nature to survive during its darkest days. And the strange part is that this gamble began much earlier than you might think, long before there was even a single human on Earth. Most people trace the history of alcohol back a few thousand years to when humans discovered agriculture. History books generally perpetuate this misconception. But if we truly want to understand the origins of this story, we need to turn the dial of the time machine back exactly 10 million years and venture into the wild depths of the tropical forests. Our ancestors couldn't even stand on two legs yet. They were primates leaping from branch to branch at the tops of trees, chasing after fruit. Back then, finding food in the tropical forests was quite literally a matter of life and death. There was fierce competition to snatch those fresh, ripe, and delicious fruits from the trees. The strong got the best fruit, while the weak went hungry.
In this battle, the fruit that fell to the ground posed a major problem. Fruit that fell to the ground rotted quickly, and its high sugar content was converted by wild yeast into ethanol, that is, the pure alcohol we know. For all other mammals and animals, these piles of rotten fruit on the ground were literally deadly poison. Animals that ate those fruits were poisoned, their livers failed, or they became intoxicated and easily fell prey to a predator. But our helpless ancestors high up in those trees were so hungry and so cornered that, having no other choice, they tried eating those poisonous fruits. It was precisely at that moment of life and death that nature bestowed upon our lineage one of history's greatest evolutionary tricks, the ADH4 gene. 10 million years ago, a minor copying error occurred in the primate genetic code, and this gene suddenly became active. This small mutation enabled our bodies to break down alcohol 40 times faster and more effectively than any other living creature. Just imagine, all of a sudden, a massive all-you-can-eat buffet, one that all your competitors in the forest had turned their backs on, warning it's poisonous, don't touch it, it'll kill you, was left exclusively for us. The scent of alcohol became an ancient navigation device for our ancestors, shouting through the forest, "Hey, there are high-energy, free calories right here." So friends, we didn't start consuming alcohol initially to have a good time or enjoy the weekend. We did it literally to avoid starving to death and going extinct. The fact that Grug swallowed that foul-smelling fruit on the ground that day, survived, and passed that gene on to us was one of the greatest turning points in human evolution. However, this simple survival mechanism would reach a much crazier, much more uncontrollable dimension thousands of years later when human intelligence came into play. Let's fast forward a bit further to about 13,000 years ago and together debunk that biggest myth in human history that's never told in school textbooks. Ever since elementary school, we've all been told the same cliched story. Humans domesticated wheat, discovered agriculture, began making bread to fill their bellies, and as a result, settled down to tend their fields, establishing villages. So, civilization was built in the bread line, was it? But what if I told you this story might actually be completely backwards? What if our real goal wasn't to fill our bellies with dry bread, but simply to throw a great party as a tribe? In recent years, deep archaeological excavations in caves around the world have unearthed evidence that would make historians blush. The timeline is around 11,000 BC. There were no cultivated fields, no domesticated grains of wheat, and no settled village life. People were still nomadic, still hunter-gatherers. However, archaeologists found some very strange residues inside the cave niches from this period. Chemical analyses revealed the following. Even though these people didn't yet know how to make bread, they were grinding wild barley and grains in large stone mortars, adding water, and letting the mixture ferment for days. In other words, as a species, we had learned to produce primitive beer a full 1,000 years before we even learned to pull fresh bread out of the oven. So, let's go back to the scene. Grug and his friends have spent the entire day chasing mammoths in the wild, fleeing predators, and are returning to the cave in the evening completely exhausted. They take turns passing around and drinking that sour, foamy liquid that has been sitting in the stone hollow for days. Alcohol suddenly triggers the dopamine mechanism in that primitive human brain. In that wild world where death is a constant threat, that constantly vigilant, highly stressed brain takes its first deep, peaceful breath. But here's the most important part. When they sit side by the cave fire with that stranger from the neighboring tribe, a man they would normally spear on sight and whom they don't trust at all, and share that liquid, the savage hostility between them vanishes for a moment. Alcohol was the first global social glue that held together wild human communities who distrusted one another and were constantly at war and fostered trust among them. So, my friends, what actually built civilization and brought us together wasn't the fear of starvation, but the desire for social interaction brought on by that tipsy state of mind. We cultivated fields so we could drink beer. The rest was just a detail.
So how did this primitive beverage over time evolve from a simple cave pastime into a sacred, mystical force that spread throughout the world? Let's rewind to 9,000 years ago, around 7,000 BC. People were gradually beginning to practice agriculture in small communities and establishing their first primitive villages. And alcohol was no longer just a food found by chance or a reward after a hunt. It became the greatest tool of magic for the tribe's most mysterious and feared figure, the shaman. Imagine the depths of a pitch-black cave. Only a faint fire burns in the center, casting enormous, eerie shadows on the wall.
The shaman begins to make the tribe members take turns drinking the liquid from that special clay pot in his hand. But this is no ordinary drink. It's an incredibly potent and intense mixture of wild fruits, honey, grains, and sometimes mildly hallucinogenic plants that have been left to ferment for days. After a few big gulps, our grug's eyes widen like saucers. Everything starts spinning, and the lifeless bison drawings on the cave wall seem to come to life in the firelight, moving and charging toward him. What we in modern medicine call excessive alcohol consumption or intoxication was for ancient people a sacred gateway to the afterlife. They didn't simply think they were getting high or having fun. They believed that when they drank that liquid, they were connecting with the spirit world, hearing the voices of the gods, and achieving immortality. Excavations of ancient tombs around the world reveal that the tribe's most powerful healers and shamans were buried alongside the remains of these alcoholic elixirs. We must clearly acknowledge this. If those first primitive drinks hadn't been consumed in those dark caves, perhaps humankind would never have mustered such reckless courage in the face of the unknown, and would never have dared to step out from behind those safe cave walls to explore the world and conquer nature. Now let's sit back and take a look at this massive, million-year-old picture together. When you head to a bar with friends on Friday night after work to shake off the week's fatigue, or when you stretch out on your couch at home after a very stressful day and reach for a glass to forget about it, do you know what you're actually doing? You're not acting like a modern 21st century person working in an office building and using the latest smartphone. You're actually replicating, down to the last detail, that primitive ancestor of yours who millions of years ago in that wild forest was starving, whose brain had broken down from living in constant vigilance, and who was desperately reaching for that sour, rotten fruit on the ground just to survive. That evolutionary gamble, which began 10 million years ago out of sheer desperation to survive, eventually led to the first beer parties in caves, then to the shaman's mysterious and dark rituals, and finally to the very center of our modern social life today. Alcohol was a bitter, poisonous medicine that nature gave us to keep us from dying or perishing from starvation. We, as humanity, took that medicine, domesticated it, and transformed it into a massive social bond upon which we built our civilization. Today, every time we raise our glasses at bars or around the dinner table, we're not just celebrating the drink on the table. We raise them in memory of our friend Grug, who millions of years ago sniffed that rotten, foaming fruit on the ground and said, "This tastes awful. It could kill me, but I have to try it to ensure the survival of my lineage," and who left us that magnificent genetic legacy. Despite all this dazzling technology, skyscrapers, spacecraft, and modern chaos around us, how much we still resemble those first humans sitting by the fireplace in the shadow of the cave wall, and how, in truth, we haven't changed, have we?